Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 7, Part 1. In this tutorial we are going to focus only on Macbeth's opening soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 7. It's one of the most famous and important soliloquies in the play Macbeth. And it's really important to look at it in detail because a student of the play should be focusing on what this soliloquy reveals about Macbeth's character and also his thought processes, because he says some really significant things in this soliloquy that we should bear in mind as we analyse and consider his character throughout the play. When Act 1 Scene 7 starts, some time has passed since the end of the previous scene. The feast is already in full swing, and at some stage during the feast, Macbeth has taken himself away from the dining table and is on his own, either in a room or a corridor near to where the banquet is taking place. The stage directions for Scene 7 usually say something like this. Inside Macbeth's castle, enter a butler and various servants, with dishes and service over the stage. That's to give the impression that the feast is going ahead. So you've got various servants and attendants crossing the stage with trays and plates and that sort of thing. Then enter Macbeth. So he's taken himself away from the dining table. We've got to imagine that, sometimes this is depicted on stage or in the background on film, even if it's only for a short time. But we've got to picture Macbeth actually by himself at this stage. Remember, a soliloquy is a speech where there is usually only one person on the stage, sharing deeply the thoughts that are going through their mind. So what I'll do is I shall read through the soliloquy in its entirety, and then I'll go back and analyse it with you. Macbeth says this. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here. But here upon this bank and shoal of time we jump the life to come. But in these cases we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions which being taught return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. He's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then, as his host who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, and pity like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. At that point he's interrupted by the entrance of Lady Macbeth, and in the following tutorial we'll take the analysis from there. But what about this soliloquy? To give you an idea in quick summary before we look at it in detail, we find Macbeth in this part of the play in a rather indecisive frame of mind. There is no scene in the play which details the discussion that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have after the end of Act 1, Scene 5. But clearly, by the time we get to Scene 7, they've obviously discussed the idea of murdering Duncan. And Macbeth is very hesitant. This soliloquy sees him weighing up, if you like, the pros and cons of murdering the king. Should I murder him, or shouldn't I? Macbeth finds himself presented with what we call a dichotomy, which is a choice between two extremes, really. Do I kill him, or don't I? And he's hesitating over this dichotomy, this dilemma that he finds himself in. As you can probably perceive, by the end of the soliloquy, he's pretty much talked himself out of the idea of killing Duncan. He seems to have come to the conclusion that killing Duncan is not the way forward. More about that in the next tutorial, but let's see what we have with this soliloquy here now. To begin at the beginning. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. Now I just emphasise slightly the word it here, a seemingly innocent and not particularly important word, but of course the it that Macbeth is referring to here is the murder. Notice that at the beginning of the soliloquy he can't actually name what it is he's planning to do. He can't bring himself to say the word murder. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. In other words, if I'm going to go through with this murder, then it would be best if I just got it over and done with as quickly as possible. There's a degree of irony in that line because, of course, I've just said this soliloquy finds Macbeth in a very hesitant frame of mind, so he's not rushing into anything. But he considers this idea, if I am going to do it, and I'm actually going to kill the king, then I would better get it done and over with as quickly as possible. The next part. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all. Here, but here upon this bank and shoal of time, we jump the life to come. If we just deal with those lines. I think it is quite interesting that rather than use the word murder here, Macbeth describes what he might do as an assassination, or rather the assassination. To me, when you talk about assassinations, we normally refer to figures such as politicians, occasionally celebrities. It has happened, like with John Lennon, for example. But we normally use the word assassination when somebody kills a political figure, a president or a prime minister. Assassination carries with it connotations of there being a purpose for the killing. There's a reason why somebody has killed a political figure. So Macbeth seems to, and it's pure inference and implication this, when Shakespeare has Macbeth use the word assassination rather than murder, it's implying that Macbeth is thinking that there may well be a reason, a purpose for killing Duncan. But of course the only real reason that Macbeth can possibly have for killing the king is simply because he wants the power of kingship himself. There is no justification for killing the king at all. It's what he says next which particularly gains my attention. If I was a student analysing the character of Macbeth, I would come back to this line and think quite deeply about it. We have already said, because Macbeth is our tragic hero, he has to fall from a position of respect and greatness to one of disgrace. When we're considering his character, I really invite you to think carefully about what he says here. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here. Put in a more translated version, I was going to say modern day, but we must never forget that Shakespeare is modern English. It's just highly poetic and it's highly metaphorical. What Macbeth is saying here is this: if I could get away with killing the king and there were no consequences for that killing, I would do it. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence. Trammel up means to prevent. So this idea that if I could kill the king and get away with it, and there would be no consequences for me killing the king, then I would do it. To me, that really does call into question Macbeth's morality. If I could get away with it, I would do it. What does that say about him as a character? Now, in the rest of the soliloquy, he's going to go on to discuss the fact that actually, and you might even say unfortunately, actions have consequences. But if they didn't, and I would get away with it, then I would go ahead and kill the king, no problem at all. He even goes so far as to say that if killing the king would allow me to get away with doing it without consequence in this life, then I'd actually take my chances in the afterlife. I'm not that bothered about what happens to me after death, if only I could get away with it in this life. That's what he means when he talks about this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here, but here upon this bank and shoal of time, we'd jump the life to come. I would take my chances in the afterlife if I could guarantee that I'd get away with the murder here and now. Just before I say anything more on that, I draw your attention to the fact that Macbeth says we would jump the life to come. You're probably familiar with this expression and this phrase, the royal we. When kings and queens, when they mean I, they say we. The reason why I bring this to your attention here is because Macbeth is not the king yet, but he's already using what we call the royal we. It's as if even though he's hesitating and weighing up his options, in his own mind, he's already king. He's even using the same sorts of expressions and wording that you would expect to hear from a monarch. So that suggests an idea of maybe arrogance and certainly the idea of the ambition. But he's also being very what we call presumptuous here. He's addressing himself, talking about himself in a royal way, and he's not even king yet. The fact that Macbeth says that he would take his chances in the afterlife, it's almost like he's saying, I'm not bothered about God's judgment, to be honest. He sort of contradicts himself a little bit further on in this soliloquy, and I'll draw your attention to it when we get to that part. But just bear that in mind, that when he's in this hesitant frame of mind where he can't quite make up a decision as to what he's going to do, there are times when he contradicts himself. So we'd jump the life to come. I'd take my chances in the afterlife if I could get away with it here and now and there'd be no consequences. Then we begin, or rather he begins, the next stage of his soliloquy. And this next stage begins with the word but. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions which being taught return to plague the inventor. What Macbeth is saying here is actually quite straightforward, although again the poetry and the metaphor of Shakespeare's language can be difficult for a first-time reader or audience member. Having reflected on this idea that if I could get away with the killing and there would be no consequences, I'd do it, Macbeth realises with that but, life doesn't work like that. If one is violent, if one teaches, as he puts it, bloody instructions, then ultimately, and what he's reflecting on here is what we would probably call karma. If you do violent things to others, then eventually karma will get you back and violent things will happen to you. In these cases, we still have judgment here. Now, that could be interpreted as the judgment of God, or it could be the judgment of fate or karma. There are consequences for actions, Macbeth realises. You can't just do something and get away with it scot-free. And if you choose to teach bloody instructions, if you choose to do violent things, which being taught return to plague the inventor. Karma will get you back eventually, and something violent and bloody will happen to you. In a way, Macbeth's considerations here are foreshadowing the ending, because indeed Macbeth is going to do something violent in a few scenes' time by actually killing Duncan, and then at the end of the play he is going to die violently as well. So in a way he's almost foretelling here, foreshadowing his own future, although of course the character of Macbeth doesn't realise that at this stage. The next thing he says is on a similar theme. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. Again, that's another poetic way of saying fate and karma will get us back eventually. If we do something metaphorically poisonous, i.e. violent and wrong, eventually that poison will come back to kill us. I always think what Shakespeare's describing here through Macbeth's language is that in the Middle Ages, and you might have seen this in films which are set in the Middle Ages, this idea of the celebratory feast and the banquet is a common one, this idea of all eating together. Of course, that's what's taking place in a room in Macbeth's castle as this soliloquy is going on. But often one of the things that the table used to do in order to prove that they were unified and there was a sense of community is they would fill a large drinking vessel with wine or ale, and then they would pass it round the table and everybody would drink from the same cup or the same chalice. And the image that Macbeth seems to be putting forward here, and obviously Shakespeare through Macbeth, is it's as if he's sat at a dining table about to engage in this drinking of the communal cup. And what he's done is before he passes it round, he's put poison in it. And everybody else at the table drinks from the cup. Eventually the cup will come back round to him. And it's almost like having forgotten that he's put poison in that cup, the cup comes back to him, he drinks from it, and he dies as well. It's just a very elaborate metaphor to suggest if you do something wrong, if you do something violent or evil, it will eventually come back round to get you once again. It's a bit like that more modern expression, what goes around comes around. That is what Macbeth is reflecting on. So all of this poetry, and don't be put off by the poetry and the metaphor, it's really this simple idea that Macbeth would do the killing if he could guarantee he'd get away with it, but he knows that life doesn't work like that. Actions have consequences. So if I, Macbeth, do something violent to Duncan, then something violent will happen to me in the end. Life, fate, karma, God will get me back eventually. In the next stage of his soliloquy, he comes up with more, I say tangible, I am speaking metaphorically of course, more tangible reasons as to why he shouldn't kill Duncan. So he really does appear to be talking himself out of it at this stage. He, meaning Duncan, he is here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Look, here I am, Macbeth, a distant relation of Duncan, and also one of his loyal subjects. They should be reason enough not to kill my king. As a loyal subject, I should not be killing my king. As a distant relation, I should not be killing a distant family member. They are two very good reasons immediately not to go through with the murder. Then, as his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. I am hosting my king in a celebratory feast. It is my job to keep him safe and secure while he's here. I should be the one stopping any attempt on his life while he's under my roof, not being the one to actually stab him to death myself. In the next part of his speech, he also reflects on some key reasons why Duncan should not be killed. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued, against the deep damnation of his taking off. Another really good reason for not killing Duncan is because he is a really good king. In fact, some of the things that Macbeth says about Duncan here make him almost saintly in the way that he's presented, and that's very deliberate on Shakespeare's part, because let's not forget that at its heart, Macbeth as a play is a play about good against evil. Macbeth, certainly from the middle of the play onwards, is evil. Duncan represents good. And so what Shakespeare's doing here in this reflection of Macbeth's is, we've not really seen much of Duncan in the play, and really this bit is to flesh out his character a little bit. We're told by Macbeth here that Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek. Now, today, if we were to describe somebody as meek, we would be suggesting that they were weak or shy in some way. It's a word that we would not see as having positive connotations. But what Shakespeare means by meek here is that Duncan is a humble king. Now, in Act 1, Scene 6, I spoke about the way that Duncan demonstrates humility in that particular scene and how it is a strength. Duncan is a humble king. He's not arrogant in his power. He rules almost as a servant. As a king, Duncan sees himself as a servant to his people. That will be in great contrast to the way that Macbeth views the position of king, but more about that when Macbeth is actually king later in the play. So one of Duncan's faculties, one of his traits, is that he is humble. We're also told that Duncan hath been so clear in his great office. Duncan is an honest ruler. He is not corrupt. He treats people honestly. Now, if Duncan was a terrible king, if he was a tyrant, if he was arrogant and dishonest and corrupt, then there might be good reason to kill him in the Middle Ages. But Macbeth is saying Duncan doesn't have these faults. He is humble and he's honest. In fact, he's so honest, we're told, that his virtues, his good points, will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued, against the deep damnation of his taking off. Again, he's using figurative language here to suggest that if I, Macbeth, kill Duncan, then heaven itself will mourn Duncan's passing because he is such a good king. It's no accident that we've got, I suppose we'd say, religious imagery here with references to angels. Trumpet-tongued, of course, recalls the idea, it's mentioned several times in the Gospels, the idea of a trumpet blast of some description sounding or heralding the arrival of, an angel or something good from God or Jesus. And so we have these religious images used here to again emphasize the idea that Duncan is such a good king, almost saintly, that heaven itself would mourn. More about that in the next few lines as well. Just before we go on to those, remember a little bit earlier we were saying about the fact that Macbeth, if he could get away with killing the king in this life with no consequences, he'd take his chances in the next life. And yet here, he references the fact that if he were to kill Duncan, then he would face deep damnation. If Duncan, the word, or rather the expression that Macbeth uses here instead of murder is taking off, and that the taking off of Duncan would lead to deep damnation. In other words, to be damned for hell, and to hell rather, and not just any damnation, deep damnation. So this is what I was referring to when I said there's a bit of a contradiction here. On the one hand, Macbeth's saying, I'm not bothered what happens to me in the afterlife. And yet the reference to deep damnation here suggests that Macbeth does fear going to hell if he were to kill the king. He next goes on to say, and pity like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. Again, these are lines which suggest that if Duncan were to be murdered, heaven itself would mourn, so much so that you would actually hear angels, heaven's cherubim, crying in the air. You would hear cries of lament and mourning from heaven. Tears shall drown the wind. You get these images that if Duncan were killed, then nature would rebel in some way. It would become stormy and turbulent. Bear those images in mind for what we are told happens after Duncan is murdered. Some of these lines will make more sense then. I also just want to reference at this point why Macbeth gives us this idea of heaven mourning Duncan if Duncan were to be murdered. In Shakespeare's day, as I understand it, and historians feel free to correct me, this particular concept was starting to die out a little bit, but certainly in the Middle Ages when the play is set, there was this firm belief in what was called the divine right of kings. The idea that the reigning monarch, the king, was God's chosen representative on earth. So when Macbeth is planning to kill the king, he's not planning to kill any ordinary mortal. He's potentially planning to kill God's representative on earth. Hence the reason that to kill a king would lead to such deep damnation, because you are going against God's will, and you are going against the natural order of things, and you're going against the divine right of kings. So that's another reason why we've got these images of storms and angels crying if Duncan were to be killed. It's Shakespeare referencing that belief that the reigning monarch was God's representative on earth, the divine right of kings. We've had to take in a lot already, just a little bit more. In these final lines, I think what Macbeth says here is very telling, and it also opens up further evaluation and analysis of his character. He sums up, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. Once again, Macbeth is using the metaphorical language that Shakespeare gives him to reflect on his situation. He uses this image of being a horse rider, and he's coming up to an obstacle that he needs to get over. And using the spurs, the sharp bits of metal that you used to use on riding boots that you used to press into a horse's sides to make it go faster, he spurs the horse on to jump over this obstacle, but ultimately the obstacle proves too big, and the horse rider ends up falling off the horse on the other side. What's all that about? Why is he using this metaphor? Well, what he's doing is he's likening his own ambition to a horse rider that takes the chance to leap over an obstacle, but that obstacle ultimately ends up tripping him over and bringing him down. Now remember, we're dealing with a tragedy here, a play which charts the downfall of an individual because of a fatal flaw in his character. And rather unusually for a tragic hero, Shakespeare has Macbeth aware of what his fatal flaw is. Macbeth realises that the only reason he would ever kill Duncan is because he wants the power of kingship. He acknowledges the fact that he has what he describes as vaulting ambition, what we would call over-ambition. And he also realises, one, that that is not a good enough reason to kill Duncan, and secondly, that ambition can lead to your downfall. That's what he's reflecting on in the final lines of this soliloquy. My ambition could bring me down. As I say, it's quite unusual for a tragic hero to know what their flaw is. It opens up an evaluative question, though. Is Macbeth's tragedy greater or lesser as a result of the fact that he knows what his fatal flaw is? Are we, the audience, more inclined to look at him more sympathetically or more unsympathetically because of the fact, and this isn't a question I'm answering, it's one that I'm putting out there because it is open to interpretation. Are we more likely to be sympathetic to him or not because of the fact that Shakespeare has him aware of his fatal flaw? One of the key issues that I would suggest here is that Macbeth knows his fatal flaw, he knows that ambition could be his downfall, and yet he gives in to it anyway. He knew that ambition could be a bad thing, but he goes against, if you like, his gut feeling. He ignores, eventually, his own reflection and analysis of the situation. He gives in to his ambition, and that ambition does indeed bring him down eventually. Just things to bear in mind about his character. If we summarise just a few of the points then, these are some of the things that I would be commenting on if I were writing an essay or evaluating the character of Macbeth. Firstly, as a result of this soliloquy only, firstly, just how honourable is Macbeth? Because we've been told earlier in the play that he's worthy, he's brave, he's valiant. All of those things are true. But just how honourable is he as a character if, as he tells us, if he could get away with doing evil, if he could get away with murder, he would do it? What do we make of the fact that he is hesitant? What do we make of the fact that at least he thinks over and weighs up the pros and cons of killing Duncan or not killing Duncan? What do we make of him as a character as a result of that aspect of this soliloquy? And finally, how do we view the fact that Shakespeare has Macbeth aware of his own flaw, knowing that he's going to give in to that flaw and allow it to bring him down eventually? Just some things to consider. But bear in mind as well that by the time we get to the end of this soliloquy, it appears that Macbeth has made up his mind and that he's talked himself out of going through with the murder. We'll see what happens as a result of this decision in the next tutorial, in which we'll focus on the rest of Act 1, Scene 7.